My name is Evelyn Hart, and 6 days ago my son led me into a cave and left me there to die. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It was a Friday when we all met at the trailhead: Daniel, his wife Erin, their 2 kids, and me. I hadn't seen Daniel in 3 months, not since the last shouting match we had about selling the land. He called it wasted potential. I called it legacy. The kids ran ahead, their little backpacks bouncing with snacks and flashlights. Erin smiled, polite and clipped as always. Daniel was quiet, distracted, checking his watch more than once and barely meeting my eyes. "This'll be good," he said, his voice oddly rehearsed. "One last adventure." We hiked in silence for the most part. The trees had already begun their autumn change, fire-colored leaves swirling down around us like confetti. I tried to enjoy it, really I did. But something in me felt off. My body wasn't tired, but my soul was uneasy. Maybe it was because we were headed toward the cave. That cave had a name: Widow's Hollow. Not a nickname. A real name on the old geological survey maps. It was part of the land my late husband and I fought so hard to preserve. Daniel had always hated it, said it was cursed, said it was useless. But my husband loved it. We spent our early years mapping its tunnels and teaching school kids about underground rivers and cave salamanders. It was where I felt closest to him, even after all these years. "Why this cave?" Daniel, I asked as we approached the gaping mouth. He shrugged. "It's the one Dad loved, right? Thought it'd be poetic." I frowned. Daniel never used words like poetic. Inside the cave smelled of damp earth and ancient silence. We strapped on headlamps and descended into the first chamber. I couldn't help but glance back toward the entrance, watching the daylight shrink behind us. "Isn't this a bit much for the kids?" I asked, concerned. Erin stepped in. "They're just going to the entrance with me. We'll set up camp there. You and Daniel can do the rest." Just Daniel and me. The last time we'd been alone together, he'd called me a selfish old woman. I should have turned around. But something in me wanted to prove him wrong, that I was still capable, still whole. Maybe even still worth listening to. Deeper into the cave we went, Daniel leading the way. He moved like he knew exactly where he was going. I kept up, noting the stalactites, the old landmarks I remembered, until we reached the chamber my husband once dubbed the cathedral for its high dome and echoing acoustics. Daniel stopped there. He turned to me with a strange smile. "You know, I never understood why you love this place." "It reminded me of something older than all of us," I said quietly. "Something that couldn't be bought or bulldozed." He said nothing, just glanced at his watch again. And then the sound came, a low, dull rumble followed by a violent jolt. The ground shifted under my feet. I screamed and instinctively braced against the wall. Rocks rained down from above, not massive ones, but enough to start a panic. Dust filled the chamber. I coughed and stumbled back, blinded by my own headlamp reflecting in the haze. When the dust cleared, the passageway we came through was partially collapsed, and Daniel was gone. "Daniel," I shouted, running to the rocks. "Daniel." No answer. I strained to listen, nothing but the familiar wet silence of stone and dripping water. I tried to move the rocks, but it was no use. Even if he had gone for help, he should have called back. At least once. But he didn't. He never did. I sat down, back pressed against a cold wall, heart thudding louder than the cave's echoes. This wasn't an accident. No. Something about the calm in his voice, the timing of it all, the way he looked at me like a problem waiting to be solved. He left me here. My own son. He brought me to a place I loved, watched me step into it, and then turned his back. I felt my throat tighten, but I wouldn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I did what I was trained to do. I took stock. In my backpack, 2 bottles of water, a few protein bars, a flashlight with fresh batteries, emergency thermal blanket, a chalk stick, a journal, and my late husband's old compass. I even had a small camping knife tucked into the side pocket. I wasn't helpless, but I was very, very alone. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to hear your own blood in your ears. The pounding wouldn't stop. I closed my eyes, pretending it was rain, the kind we used to hear while lying in our tent before Daniel grew up and turned cold. The cave didn't want me dead, but someone else might have. The betrayal began to unfurl inside me, not all at once, but like ink spreading through water. Slow, unforgiving, permanent. The cave had gone still again, but the stillness wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. I sat in the dim light of my headlamp, every second stretching like rubber stretched thin enough to snap. For a while, I called Daniel's name in intervals. Daniel Echo. Daniel Nothing. I didn't know if I was hoping he'd respond or fearing it. Eventually, I stopped shouting. There was no one to hear me. Or worse, someone was hearing and choosing not to answer. I scanned the chamber for anything familiar. The walls were marked in thin mineral lines like veins across brittle skin. I found the same carved heart my husband and I had etched 32 years ago with his pocket knife, H+E 1993, still barely visible under a sheen of limestone growth. I touched the stone. It was slick and cool. And then, the air changed. It's something you learn as a geologist, how to read caves not just with your eyes but with your body. The temperature shifted and so did the pressure. A faint gust passed my face, subtle but unmistakable. Airflow. That meant there was another way out. My pulse kicked into gear. I stood slowly and followed the draft, careful with each step. Even the smallest crack in a cave could mean a hidden tunnel or a sudden fall. I took the path Daniel and I had come from, or at least what remained of it. The collapse had sealed the most direct route, but off to the side, a narrow corridor sloped downward. I remembered it vaguely from decades ago, a path we hadn't finished mapping. It was risky, unstable, but I didn't have many choices. As I turned into the narrow passage, my light caught something that made me freeze. Footprints. Fresh ones. Boot prints in the thin coating of red clay dust. One set size 11 maybe. Daniel's size. They led down the corridor and back out, which meant he'd come this way. After the collapse, he hadn't been trapped. He walked out. He knew this cave better than he admitted. He knew there was another exit. That was when the first tear slipped out. Not because I was scared, because it was real now. He did this. I wiped my cheek roughly. There was no time to cry. I needed to think. Move. Survive. I descended the corridor, one hand brushing the wall for balance, the other gripping the flashlight. The air was colder here, moister. I could hear the faint trickle of underground water, then the crunch of gravel. I stopped, held my breath. There it was again, soft, distant, not echoing like my footsteps had. Someone was walking. I turned off my flashlight and crouched low, waiting in the dark, letting my eyes adjust. I pressed my ear to the stone wall. The sound stopped. No voice, no light, just the sound of something or someone. There. Was it Daniel Aaron? Someone else entirely? Or had I finally started to unravel? My breath caught in my throat. I had to keep going, whether the sound was real or imagined. I couldn't stay here. Further ahead, the passage opened into a tight chamber I barely remembered from my early expeditions. It had been dangerous back then, riddled with loose shale and blind drops. I mapped the route quickly in my mind, retracing it like a faded memory. And then I saw it. A small pile of energy bar wrappers, a cigarette butt, a scratched matchbox with the word Willow on it. Daniel didn't smoke, but someone had been here recently. I picked up the wrapper. It was the same brand Aaron always bought. The matchbox was unfamiliar, maybe from a local gas station. A cold realization coiled inside me. He hadn't just left me. He planned this. He stalked this spot. Made sure I'd have just enough to stay alive. Not to die immediately. No, that would draw suspicion. He wanted nature to do the job slowly. Exposure, dehydration, a fall, an accident. He wanted me to vanish. A clean ending for a messy problem. I stood slowly, legs stiff from crouching. My mouth was dry not just from thirst but from betrayal coating my tongue. What was I to him now? A weight, an obstacle. A name on a deed. I thought about Erin. Her eyes shifting during lunch when I mentioned updating my will. How she quickly changed the subject. How Daniel never pushed back when she spoke. They had done the math. The land was worth something. Now developers were offering 7 figures for access rights. But I'd refused. I'd said it belonged to the family, that it carried memories. I didn't know those memories meant nothing to them. I slumped against the stone wall and closed my eyes. I could still smell Daniel as a child, dirt, peanut butter, boyhood. I remembered holding his fevered body when he was 7, whispering that I'd never leave him. And now, here I was. Alone, but not broken. I opened my pack and took inventory again. Food enough for maybe 2 days. Water 1 full bottle, 1 half empty. Flashlight steady beam. Chalk stick intact. I took the chalk and wrote on the cave wall, Evelyn Hart. Alive. Day 2. Following airflow west. If someone came, anyone, they'd know I hadn't just laid down and given up. The cave wasn't my tomb. Not yet. I stood, gathered my things, and walked forward into the breath of the earth. Silence isn't always empty. Inside a cave, silence can fill your head like water. It swells, pressing against your thoughts until it's not quiet anymore. It's screaming. That was what I heard on the 3rd day. Not Daniel's voice. Not help. Just the pounding throb of my own heart echoing off the stone. Just the memory of him turning away. I'd walked for hours along the passage marked by those fading footprints only to hit another wall, a collapse of shale and twisted roots. This tunnel, too, had been sealed. Or maybe it was always meant to end like this. A dead end with just enough signs of hope to keep me crawling toward it. I sat down on the rocky floor, unwrapped half a protein bar, and forced myself to chew. My stomach didn't want food, but my brain did. I had to keep thinking. The flashlight was growing weaker. I'd turned it off between bursts of walking, saving every minute of battery life I could. Still, it flickered now when I tapped the casing. That kind of flicker you get when death is near. I adjusted the emergency blanket around my shoulders, crinkling silver in the dark, and I waited. No one came. No sound, no wind. Just the slow, dragging realization I wasn't lost. I'd been abandoned. The difference was sharp cold. If I were lost, Daniel would have been shouting, searching, calling in helicopters. Erin would have had the rangers scouring the region. There would have been rescue dogs. But there was none of that. Just time. And betrayal. I took out my journal, the one I always carried ever since I retired. I didn't even know why I brought it on this trip. Habit, maybe. Or hope. The same way someone keeps wearing their wedding ring long after the marriage has soured. I turned to a blank page and wrote Day 3. No help. No sound. Flashlight dimming. I am not lost. I am discarded. I stopped my pen hovering, then added, he wants me gone, and he knows no one will question it. I thought of my sister Mara. She was the only one who still called me, the only one who might think something strange if I went missing. But even she had grown tired of my resistance, my stubborn refusal to sell the land to move into a safer neighborhood to play the aging mother role everyone expected. Maybe they'd all nod when Daniel said I wandered off, that I must have gotten confused, had a stroke, vanished into the woods. People always believe the version that explains everything with the least discomfort. I closed the journal and set it beside me, and I screamed. Not words, just the raw scraping sound of fear. I screamed until the cave threw it back at me in twisted echoes. I waited for a reply. Nothing. I screamed again. This time something changed. Not an echo, but a crack. From deep within the wall to my right. At first I thought it was just the noise bouncing back. But then the crack came again, sharper. Like stone shifting. A dry whisper of gravel tumbling behind rock. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the wall. Nothing moved. But the air, it changed. Warmer. Staler. I approached slowly, feeling along the surface. My fingers caught the edge of a hairline fracture. Fresh. The wall was shifting. Settling. Or worse, preparing to collapse. I backed away instinctively. My instinct screamed, "Don't dig. Don't touch. It's not stable." But I had to know. I found a chunk of broken stone and used it like a chisel, scraping at the crack. Every hit echoed like a gunshot. I worked slowly, gritting my teeth against the vibration, and then a piece gave way. Behind it, nothing but blackness. A cavity. A hidden chamber. The opening was small, barely large enough to crawl through, but there was space. I shone the flashlight in. No floor in sight. Just descending darkness. I dropped a pebble. 1, 2, 3. Plink. Water. There was a pool down there. Maybe a spring. Maybe an underground stream. My heart kicked again. If there was water, there was a chance. I dug more, widening the whole, heart thudding so loud I thought it might draw something from the deep. When the gap was wide enough, I pushed my pack through and followed it, crawling on elbows and knees through the stone womb until gravity pulled me into the new chamber. I landed on wet rock. The air was thick and humid. My flashlight cut through the haze, revealing a pool no larger than a kiddie tub but clear and moving. A steady trickle fed it from a crack above. I leaned down and drank like an animal. Cold. Metallic. Life. It was the best thing I'd ever tasted. I sat back on my heels, gasping, trying not to cry. I didn't want to waste water on tears. Not yet. I'd survived another day. But something felt different in this chamber. As I scanned the walls, my light caught something. A mark. Fresh. Scratched into the stone, almost recent enough to bleed. "Sorry, Mom." The letters were jagged, uneven, carved with a knife. Or a key. And next to them, a date. 3 days ago. The day we entered the cave. I stared at it for a long time. My son hadn't just planned to leave me. He came down here first. Marked it. Maybe he wanted to return. Or maybe he just wanted a place to mourn. Or to absolve himself. Either way, it meant only one thing. He knew. He chose. And now it was just me and this stone chamber. The water. The word sorry echoing like a curse. No map would lead me out. No one was coming in. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. It's strange what memories come crawling back when you're sealed inside a place that breathes with the weight of the earth. Not the birthdays, not the graduations or baby pictures or sunny afternoons. No, it's the buried ones. The ones you pretended didn't matter. I sat in that wet chamber with Daniel's etched "Sorry, Mom" staring back at me like a tombstone. And I remembered something that had stayed locked up for decades. The first time Daniel came to this cave, he was 10. He'd begged to come with me and Henry, my husband, on one of our mapping trips. He wanted to be part of it, wanted to explore the cave like the brave little man he thought he was. We gave him a tiny helmet and a spare headlamp, and I remember his hand in mine trembling with both fear and excitement. But an hour in, he panicked. The air had changed that day, too, a strange gust through a side tunnel that made the cave howl like it was alive. Daniel screamed and started hyperventilating. Henry tried to calm him, but it was me who pulled him into my lap, who whispered the story of the mountain's sleeping giant to distract him. I told him the wind was just the giant snoring that as long as we stayed respectful and quiet, the mountain would keep us safe. He believed me. He always believed me until he didn't. Somewhere between boyhood and now, something broke in him. A crack that widened year by year until he looked at me not like a mother, but like an obstacle, a wall. And now, here I was, trapped inside the very same cave where I once protected him. Only now he had shut the door. After resting for a while beside the water, I decided to move again. My flashlight was flickering more frequently, and I knew I had maybe a few hours of light left if that. I gathered my things and climbed to the far end of the chamber. There was a low arch, the kind you had to crawl through belly down. Dangerous but promising. Air flowed faintly through it. Where there's air, there's life. Sliding through tight rock spaces used to be thrilling. Now it felt like being swallowed. The stone pressed against my ribs with every inch. I had to leave my pack behind to squeeze through. It was a risk, but if I stayed, I'd rot in regret. The tunnel twisted and dropped. I fell once hard, maybe 4 or 5 feet, and my elbow slammed into rock. I bit my tongue not to scream. The pain was sharp, immediate. I cradled it, trying to move it. Not broken. Maybe sprained. I kept going. Eventually, the path widened again. This time into a chamber I hadn't seen before. Smaller, but strange. Someone had been here. Recently. There were soot marks on the wall, the kind left by matches or a weak campfire. And in the corner, a pile of old fabric. A blanket. Molded, yes, but once clean. And beside it, a small camping knife. I stared at the blanket. It was blue, with faded cartoon owls on it. It was Daniel's childhood blanket. He hadn't just come back to the cave as an adult, he had returned to it. Alone. Before this trip. More than once. He had, staged this? Rehearsed it? Suddenly the thought occurred to me. This cave didn't just represent escape for him. It represented control. A place where he decided who entered, who left, who was remembered. And me, I had taken that from him once. I had carried him out when he couldn't find his way. Now he was rewriting the story. I picked up the knife. It was rusted but solid, and I held it tighter than I expected. Not out of fear, out of something darker. Resolve. I spent hours searching for another passage from that room. The air was damp but steady. No sign of mold, which meant there was ventilation, and that meant there was a way out. I marked the walls with my chalk as I moved, arrows pointing back. I remembered how I used to teach the local kids how to navigate caves. Always mark your trail, always conserve your light, always leave something of yourself behind in case you never return. That last one had hit harder than I expected. Eventually, I found it. A fissure. Vertical. It stretched upward like a jagged wound in the rock, barely wide enough for my shoulders. The climb would be brutal and dangerous, but it was climbable. I tied the emergency blanket into strips, wrapped them around my injured elbow for support, and tested the first few footholds. The stone was slick, but firm. Every movement sent pebbles clattering down into darkness, but I climbed anyway. Because that's what we do, isn't it, mothers? We climb. Even when we're broken. Even when the only person waiting at the top is the one who put us down there to begin with. I paused halfway up, clinging to the rock, my breath ragged, headlight now barely more than a pulse of light. And I whispered something to myself I hadn't said in years. I don't forgive you. I wasn't sure who I meant. Daniel. Myself. Henry for dying too soon and leaving me to be the villain in our son's eyes. Maybe all of us, maybe none. But the truth was heavy and sharp in my mouth. I don't forgive you. And still, I kept climbing. I reached the top of the fissure with my body trembling and scraped raw. My flashlight finally gave its last flicker just as I hauled myself onto the ledge. I was in total darkness now, not night dark, but cave dark. The kind of dark that wraps around your eyes like a blindfold you can't take off. But I wasn't scared of it anymore. Because in this kind of dark, I didn't have to see the truth I already knew. I leaned against the cold stone and let my breathing slow. Somewhere in the silence, water dripped rhythmically. 1, 2, 3. It sounded like a heartbeat. Not mine. The cave's. I pulled the chalk from my jacket pocket. The stub was worn down to almost nothing. My hands ached from the climb, my fingernails rimmed with dirt and blood. Still, I found a dry stretch of stone and began writing. Evelyn Hart. Day 4. Still alive. Moving north by feel. Then I added on a separate wall. Daniel Hart. This is not forgiveness. Writing that made my fingers shake. But it steadied something inside me. My name was still mine. My voice was still mine. I had not disappeared. Even if no one ever found this message, it would stand here long after I was gone, the only monument I might get. Crawling through darkness strips you of your identity. You stop being a woman or a mother or even a person. You become will. You become breath. You become instinct. I moved by touch, inch by inch, along the stone using the blade of the camping knife to test for solid footing for hollows in the wall. Sometimes I whispered my own name just to hear a human sound. Evelyn. Evelyn Hart. Evelyn. And then I found something unexpected. The floor beneath me changed texture, from rough stone to something flat, almost man-made. I reached down and felt it, a smooth concrete edge broken by patches of soil. A path. No, a foundation. Someone had built something here once. A structure. A base camp. I crawled forward and found the corner of a rusted steel panel. And then, with both hands, the base of what used to be a lantern stand. This was one of the old research stations from back when Henry and I had submitted our preservation proposal to the state. We'd documented this area in detail. There had been a camp table, some storage bins, and a small wooden bench. But it was all gone now, decayed into fragments. Except a plastic container, cracked, but still sealed. With trembling hands, I pried it open. Inside was an old flashlight busted and a notebook in a zip bag. My heart stopped. It was Henry's. I recognized his handwriting instantly, slanted and clean, always with a line under every heading. W.H. Log, Widow's Hollow, July 1995. I sat down right there in the dirt and flipped it open, hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper. He'd written notes about airflow mineral patterns and acoustic anomalies, but halfway through, I found this. Daniel panicked today again. Evelyn says it's nothing, but I'm starting to wonder. He keeps asking if I love him more than her. He's too young to be thinking that way. Something's off in him. It scares me. I read the passage again, and again. Then I turned the page. He took Evelyn's compass and hid it. She didn't even notice. Said she felt strange when we came back up. Said it felt like the mountain wanted to keep her. I think Daniel wanted that too. I dropped the journal. The cave wasn't the beginning of Daniel's darkness. It was the mirror that had always reflected it. Even then he'd resented me, competed with me, not because I was cruel, but because I mattered too much. Henry knew. He saw it. But he never said anything to me. Maybe he didn't want to believe it either. Maybe we all thought it would pass. That it was childhood. That it would fade. It didn't. It hardened. And now that bitterness had crystallized into something real, a plan. A murder disguised as an accident. A slow erasure. I lay down on the cave floor and stared into the dark. Not to rest, just to be still. To let the truth settle in my bones. My son had been trying to remove me for a long, long time. It just took him decades to find the perfect place to do it. Eventually, I gathered what was left of my strength. I tore the page from Henry's journal with those entries and slipped it into my shirt. If I made it out, I would not return in silence. I would show it to Mara, to the police, to the world if I had to. I was done protecting his name at the cost of my own life. I stood up, and something caught my eye, a soft shimmer from the far edge of the chamber. I moved toward it, hand out, and my fingers brushed a metal bracket. A light switch. Dead, of course, but a sign. There was electricity here once, and that meant somewhere nearby there was an exit, a hatch, a maintenance tunnel, something. For the first time in days I smiled, a real smile, not of hope, of warning. Daniel had miscalculated. The cave had kept me, but it hadn't broken me. And now it was giving me back. There's a moment after grief, after betrayal, when you no longer feel weak, just focused. You stop asking why. You start thinking how. That's where I was now, standing in a darkened chamber beside a dead light switch and an old bracket heart pounding like a second pulse in my throat. Somewhere nearby there had been electricity. That meant infrastructure, which meant people, or at least the memory of them, and it meant escape. I moved slowly, pressing my palms against the walls, sweeping for clues. The stone gave way in places to poured concrete, slick with condensation. I tapped with the butt of the knife. Hollow. Solid. Hollow again. Then I heard it, the faintest clink. I crouched and found it, a steel ring embedded into the floor. Cold to the touch. Caked with grime. I tugged it once. It held firm. But the second pull, with my full body weight behind it, gave a groan, a low metallic protest. I fell back as a panel lifted slow and stiff. It wasn't a door. Not exactly. More like a sealed hatch, maybe part of an old research access tunnel. I shone my failing flashlight inside, nothing but darkness and rusted ladder rungs leading down. Yes, down. Not what I expected. But something inside me said, trust the directionless path. Trust the same instincts that once led you back to light in caves, far deeper than this. I tied the remains of my emergency blanket to the first rung, giving it a test pull. Solid. And then I climbed down. The shaft was narrow, maybe a service tunnel or old mine access point. Damp air pressed in from all sides. My fingers burned against the rusted rungs. My elbow screamed from the fall 2 days ago, but I clenched my jaw and kept going. 10 feet, 15, 20. Then my foot hit something solid, a platform. I stepped off and blinked in the dark. It was a corridor. Not stone, but man-made. Reinforced concrete walls. A narrow strip of wiring ran overhead, broken in places. This had been built, funded, designed. I turned left. Chose one direction like flipping a coin. After 50 paces, I saw a faint glint, a red LED blinking. I hurried toward it and found an old fuse box. Next to it, a panel. And beneath that, a box of expired glow sticks, probably from the late 90s. I cracked one open. It lit with a dim, sour green glow. And I almost cried. Not because I was out of danger, I wasn't. But because the cave was no longer Daniel's domain. This place had belonged to others before him. Scientists. Engineers. Me. He might have known about it. But he didn't own it. And now I had a map in my mind. If I was right, this tunnel should connect to the original testing chamber, the one Henry had insisted we never tell the state about. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was sacred to him. His private space. The chamber where he made his final notes just weeks before he died. I moved with more speed now. My steps echoed like warnings. At one point, the tunnel turned sharply. I nearly missed the side entrance, a narrow stairwell climbing up behind a rusted steel door wedged open by a stone. Someone had left it that way. I stepped inside, and the air changed. Again. This time it wasn't decay. It wasn't earth. It was soap. Faint. Artificial. Recent. I froze. Listened. And there, the faintest scrape. A shoe sole on concrete, followed by stillness. Not imagined. Not hallucinated. Someone was here. I backed into the stairwell, my pulse rising. My instincts screamed, don't make a sound. I turned the glow stick inward so it wouldn't cast a beam. Then I crouched and waited. For nearly a full minute there was only silence. Then a cough, a throat being cleared, a voice. Male, muffled, but familiar. I told you she'd go toward the tunnel. She always took the long way out. I held my breath. A second voice, quieter. Female. She's still alive, Jesus Daniel. A silence that cracked the air in half. Doesn't matter, he said finally. She'll go deeper. It'll flood eventually. Let the cave finish what I started. My grip on the knife tightened. They weren't just letting me die. They were monitoring it, planning it. Erin was in on it. Of course she was. Maybe she had been the entire time. I moved back down the stairwell like a ghost, feet silent on the stone. My hand found the journal page in my pocket. Henry's handwriting. His warning. Daniel's obsession hadn't just been personal. It was pathological. Strategic. He had studied me like I was one of his childhood puzzles, and he had used my own knowledge of geology of these caves against me. But he'd underestimated one thing. I didn't love the cave because it was safe. I loved it because it taught me how to survive. I waited until their voices drifted away, until I heard footsteps echo off into another tunnel. Then I retraced my steps back into the corridor and toward the chamber I had once thought lost. I reached it by feel a domed space ribbed with stone pillars and lined with the echo of still water. And at its center, the old table, rotted, covered in dust, and beneath it a case. I pulled it free, heart in my throat. Inside flares, a whistle, and Henry's old waterproof map. I exhaled. He'd left it for me. Not for Daniel. For me. I traced my finger along the ink, a narrow route to the surface marked with 3 red stars. One was labeled Great, Upper West Ravine. I kissed the paper. Whispered, "Thank you." Then I stood up. Because now I had everything I needed. Not just to get out, but to make Daniel face me. Above ground. Face to face. And this time I'd be the one choosing what gets buried. The route marked on Henry's map wasn't just a lifeline, it was a memory lane laced with sorrow. I remembered when he first drew it. We were in our living room late at night. Daniel was upstairs pretending to sleep, but probably listening. Henry had been obsessed with exit contingencies back then, not out of fear, but out of reverence. He always said caves shouldn't own you, that it was your responsibility to know the way out before you ever stepped inside. He had written in tiny, careful script, Great, Upper West Ravine, covered with brush, steep slope, one-person crawl. It was my only real chance now. I slipped the map into my jacket, tied the knife securely to my hip with some elastic cord I'd salvaged, and took one last look at the chamber. This had been Henry's sanctuary, his truth buried deep. Now it was mine too. I whispered a quiet thank you and started moving. The passage to the ravine was narrow, almost claustrophobic, and the air had grown thinner. I rationed the last of my water, letting it wet my tongue without fully swallowing. My lips were cracked, and my throat burned every time I breathed. Somewhere above me, Daniel was likely packing up camp with Erin, telling the kids some lie about Grandma needing quiet time. Or maybe, if he was feeling bold, that I'd decided to wander off alone like an old fool who didn't know when to stop. He knew how to shape a story to sound noble. It was the kind of manipulation that didn't look like evil on paper. Not unless you'd seen the planning beneath it. Not unless you'd survived it. Hours passed. Maybe more. It was hard to tell in the dark. But eventually, the passage changed. The stone gave way to broken gravel and the air grew brighter, not light exactly, but less dark. I climbed a steep incline, every step sliding back an inch. Then my hand broke through brush. Damp leaves. Twigs. Open air. My breath caught in my chest. I clawed forward with renewed urgency. The last stretch was brutal. The grate had nearly rusted shut, but I found a weak hinge and pried until my shoulder screamed in protest. The grate gave with a snap, and a metallic whine, and I was outside. It hit me like a wave trees, wind, the smell of dirt and pine needles and freedom. I collapsed onto the forest floor, staring at the sky gray with early evening cloud. Not beautiful, but real. The cave had let me go. Or maybe I had taken myself back. I lay there for several minutes before sitting up. I wasn't safe yet. The ravine was still deep within the forest, but I recognized the slope. We were only about a mile from the original trailhead. Daniel had likely assumed no one could find the grate. Maybe he hadn't even known about it. That would be his mistake. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me and began the climb through the underbrush. Halfway up the slope, I heard something: voices. Children's laughter. Leaves crunching. I crept toward the sound. And then through the trees I saw them. Daniel, Aaron, the kids. At the campsite. It looked normal. Like any family picnic. They were packing the last of the supplies into the car. Daniel laughed at something Aaron said. The kids were running in circles with sticks. Not a trace of worry. No sign of a search team. No indication that someone they loved had been missing for nearly 6 days. That laugh, his laugh, snapped something in me. I stepped into the clearing. Daniel turned. At first he didn't recognize me. I must have looked like a ghost. Dirt-streaked, hair matted, eyes bloodshot, clothes torn. Then recognition dawned. And behind it, something else. Not relief. Not guilt. Disappointment. He took a step forward, smiling carefully. Mom. What the hell? We were about to call the Rangers? Don't lie to me, I said. My voice was hoarse, but it cut through the air like glass. Aaron froze. The kids stopped playing, their eyes wide. Daniel glanced at them, then back at me. What are you talking about? I pulled Henry's journal page from my jacket and threw it at his feet. You knew exactly what you were doing. You walked me into that cave with a smile and left me to rot. He didn't move to pick it up. He just stared at it. Quiet. Calculating. Then softly, you shouldn't have gone that deep. I told you to stay with Aaron and the kids. I almost laughed. That was the plan, wasn't it? Leave me just close enough to make it look like an accident, like I wandered off, like I was too old, too slow. He didn't deny it, didn't say a word. I looked at Aaron. And you helped him. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the kids. That was all the confirmation I needed. I pulled my phone dead battery, but it didn't matter. I held it up for show. I've documented everything. Your notes, your footprints, your voice. Daniel's jaw clenched. You can't prove I can, I said. And I will. For the first time, he looked rattled. Not ashamed. Not sorry. Just afraid because the plan had failed. And I was still here. I turned and walked away. Not back into the woods. Toward the road. Toward the ranger station. Let them try to spin their story. Let them try to clean up the narrative. Because now I had the truth. And the cave had given me something even Daniel never saw coming: a witness. The ranger station sat at the edge of the forest like a forgotten outpost tucked between pine trees and gravel roads. By the time I reached it, twilight had begun to bleed into the sky, casting long blue shadows across the clearing. I must have looked like something out of a nightmare. Blood-streaked hair tangled my clothes, reeking of sweat and cave mildew. But I walked in upright. Not stumbling. Not weak. I didn't need pity. I needed to be heard. A young officer behind the counter, barely older than Daniel, looked up from his clipboard and froze. Ma'am, are you okay? I walked straight up to the counter and dropped the torn journal page onto the surface between us. Call someone higher up, I rasped. You're going to want to hear this. The questions came fast. Who was I? Where had I been? What proof did I have? I gave them everything I could: names, locations, the exact coordinates of the side chamber, the map, the plastic container with Henry's handwriting, and the path I had taken through the maintenance tunnel. I recited Daniel's words in that echo chamber word for word, the tone, the rhythm, the pause, before. Let the cave finish what I started. They listened, took notes, stared at me like they didn't know whether to believe the story or send me to the hospital. I need you to check the old geological records, I told them. My name is Evelyn Hart. My husband and I registered that site with the state decades ago. That land is still under my name. I never signed anything over to my son. One of the older rangers nodded. I remember that name, he said. Widow's Hollow? Off limits these days, but yeah. Your husband filed preservation reports in the 90s. Then you know, I'm not making this up. The younger one said, You said your son led you into the cave. Yes, I said. And then he left. On purpose. He planned it with his wife. I have no doubts. They exchanged a glance. And then came the line I had expected but dreaded. We'll need to speak to him. When they brought Daniel in, he looked polished. Clean shirt, pressed jeans, calm expression. His voice dripped concern. I was just about to report her missing. She wandered off 2 days ago. We thought she might have fallen. I've been out searching 6 days, I interrupted. He turned toward me, eyes narrowing. What you said 2 days? It's been 6. You didn't notice. Or are you just a bad liar? He said nothing. The ranger stepped in. Sir, your mother says you left her in the cave deliberately, that you had mapped the area and knew of additional passages. Daniel's smile didn't waver. I didn't map anything. I haven't been in that cave since I was a kid. Mom must have imagined things. She's been struggling. There it was. The quiet weapon. Discredit the witness. Paint her as fragile, confused, elderly. She's had some memory issues lately, he continued. Nothing diagnosed, of course, but we were thinking of getting her checked. I walked out of there with a dislocated elbow, 5 pages of my husband's handwriting, and the memory of your voice, Daniel. He looked at me, really looked, and I saw it. That flicker of fury under the calm. The mask slipping. He knew I wasn't going to vanish quietly. He knew I had survived the one place that was supposed to silence me forever. They separated us after that. The rangers asked for an official statement. I gave it. Slowly, carefully. I described every room, every marking, every supply he'd planted the cigarette butts, the wrappers the sorry mom scratched into stone. I even offered to lead them back into the cave. Not now, I was too weak, but soon. Just make sure he doesn't disappear in the meantime, I told them. The older ranger nodded. I believe you, Evelyn. It was the first time anyone had said that to me in years, and I felt something in my chest loosen. They offered me a cot in the back room. I lay down and stared at the ceiling fan spinning overhead. And for the first time in 6 nights, I slept. Not just closed-eye rest. A full, heavy, dreamless sleep. Like the cave itself had finally let go of my mind. When I woke, there was sunlight. And silence. Not the kind that screams, the kind that heals. I sat outside the station wrapped in a blanket, sipping warm tea from a thermos. Across the lot, Daniel stood talking to Aaron beside their SUV. The rangers kept a respectful distance but didn't let him leave. Good. He didn't deserve freedom. Not yet. Not after what he tried to take from me. Not after what he built inside that cave, a grave for a woman who loved him too much to see the monster growing behind his smile. He turned once to look at me. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just held his gaze. And nodded once. A single message between us. You failed. They released Daniel later that afternoon. No handcuffs. No arrest. Just a quiet conversation between him and the ranger sergeant behind closed doors. When he emerged, he looked calm, polished, like someone stepping off a golf course, not a crime scene. They said they needed more. That a mother's word, even a mother with bruises on her elbows and blood crusted along her temple, wasn't quite enough. That even a journal page from a long-dead husband wasn't what they'd call conclusive. That scratched messages on cave walls, though eerie, didn't prove intent. They needed something sharper than instinct and stronger than testimony. They needed a crime you could package neatly. Daniel knew that. He'd counted on it. I watched him walk toward his car shoulders, square eyes forward. Erin waited behind the wheel, her face unreadable behind tinted glass. I sat on the station's front bench wrapped in a ranger-issued blanket still smelling like damp earth and old stone. I didn't speak. Neither did he. But when his eyes finally flicked toward me just briefly, I caught the look. That cold, calculating flicker. The flicker of a man watching the clock, not the consequence. He was already rewriting the story in his head. And that was when I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. My sister Mara arrived just after sunset headlights casting long shadows across the gravel lot. She jumped out before the car had fully stopped running toward me like we were both still children. "Oh my God, Evelyn," she gasped, catching me in her arms. "They said you were missing. Daniel said you were." I hugged her back, stiff and aching, my bones crying out beneath the weight of her warmth. I hadn't touched a single living soul in 6 days. Not lovingly, not knowingly. It felt like surfacing. "I'm here," I whispered. That was all I could say for a while. Back in her car with the seat warmer humming beneath me and the smell of her lavender lotion filling the cabin, I finally broke the silence. "He left me there, Mara." She glanced over but didn't interrupt. I wasn't lost. I wasn't confused. He walked me into that cave and walked away. She gripped the wheel tighter. I knew something was off when he called me, the way he said it so matter of fact. Mom wandered off. Like it didn't even bother him. "He's always had a way of talking like that," I said. "Even when he was a child. Like he was observing everything from the outside, even his own feelings." "Do they believe you? The Rangers believe something happened?" But legally, I shook my head. They want more. Concrete proof. A confession, maybe? A camera? Anything but a mother's scars. Mara's jaw clenched. Then we give them more. At home, I walked through my door as if entering someone else's life. My tea mug still sat on the counter where I'd left it. The house smelled like lavender and dust. Mail was stacked neatly on the hallway, table bills and catalogs that now felt absurd, like artifacts from a time before survival. But I didn't cry. I was past crying. I walked into Henry's study, my study now, and sat at his old desk. The oak still bore the small chip on the right side from the time Daniel knocked over a lamp during a tantrum. I had yelled, Henry had defended him, and the argument had ended like so many of ours did, quietly unresolved. I opened the bottom drawer. Inside his maps, dozens of them, folded with care, labeled in pencil. Most were of local topography, but one was unmistakably personal. Widow's Hollow. He had drawn it with love, not just precision. The paths were outlined with handwritten notes. E said this tunnel smells like iron. D too afraid to cross here, maybe later. Memories stitched in ink. And there at the bottom right corner, his handwriting again. Great Upper West Ravine. Evelyn's path. Always keep this one clear. I traced the letters with my finger as if touching them might summon his voice again. He'd left that path for me, not Daniel, and I had followed it. The next morning the email started. The Rangers had filed an official report and somehow, somewhere, it had leaked. Maybe someone tipped off the press. Maybe Daniel had tried to get ahead of the story, leaking a version of events to make me seem unstable. But people were talking. Some just sent kind wishes. Others said they'd experienced something similar, betrayal from a child, gaslighting from a family member. But one message stopped me cold. The subject line, he asked me about your will. It was from Angela, Henry's cousin. We hadn't spoken in years. Evelyn, I saw the article. I'm so sorry. I believe you. Daniel called me last fall. Said you were declining mentally and that he was taking on more responsibility. He asked if I knew anything about your estate, or if Henry had mentioned changing the title on the land. I thought he was just trying to help you, but now I see. I'm here. Whatever you need. Angela. I stared at the screen, heart slow and steady. Not because I was surprised, because I was finally sure. Daniel hadn't panicked in the cave and made a terrible choice. He'd planned it. He'd asked around, calculated risk, plotted a path with no cameras, no witnesses, no one who'd question a frail mother's disappearance. But the cave had done something he hadn't expected. It gave me back. It gave me evidence. It gave me Angela. It gave me myself. Later that night, the sheriff's office called. The deputy sounded different this time, not just polite, but focused. We've reopened the file, he said. As a potential attempted homicide, we're following up with the preservation registry and we've started coordinating with the parks department. We'd like to set up a formal interview. I nodded slowly. I'll be ready, I said. Would you consider going public with your story? He asked. I didn't hesitate. Yes, but it has to be in my words. Because I knew Daniel. He would try to beat me to it. He would lean into his charm. Paint a picture of a confused old woman lost in the forest, a grieving son doing his best, a tragic misunderstanding. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a story of precision and cruelty. And now it was mine to tell. The moment I sat down at Henry's old oak desk, a wave of memories crashed over me as fierce and unyielding as the mountain streams we'd once traced together. This was the same desk where I had once spread out topographical maps, carefully charting caves and rivers with him by my side. The worn surface, pocked with small dents and scratches, bore silent witness to decades of our family's stories, some joyful, some aching, and some unbearably dark. The house around me was deathly silent, the kind of silence that seeps into your bones and makes your heartbeat thunder in your ears. I could hear the steady tick of the clock on the wall each second like a slow drumbeat marking time I could never get back. Before me, the laptop's blank screen glowed cold and uninviting, the blinking cursor urging me to speak, to write, to finally tell the story I'd hidden away for so long. For years, I had carried this story inside me, wrapped in layers of denial, fear, and desperate hope. Hope that Daniel might change. Hope that the family might heal. Hope that the nightmare could be undone. But those hopes were fragile threads stretched thin by time and betrayal. Now, with the cave behind me and the darkness lifted, I knew I had to write it down, to lay the truth bare, no matter how raw or painful. I began cautiously, not with the suffocating darkness of the cave or the rawness of betrayal, but with the subtle cracks that had crept into my life over many years. The little signs I had chosen to ignore or excuse, because facing them meant facing a truth too terrible to bear. I wrote about Daniel's eyes, how they changed over time, the way they would harden when I spoke about the land, the flicker of something cold and distant hiding behind his carefully controlled expressions. I remembered the endless conversations, the silent wars over selling the land that Henry and I had preserved with so much love. To Daniel, it was just a piece of real estate. To me, it was the last thread tying us to Henry's memory. I wrote about Erin too. The way her eyes would flit away when the topic of inheritance came up, the tightness in her smile, the subtle glances she exchanged with Daniel like two actors rehearsing a script that excluded me. The polite silences, the unspoken agreements, they felt like betrayals as sharp as any knife. And then I confessed the worst part, that I had softened these moments, excused them because I was terrified. Terrified that if I faced the truth, if I acknowledged the coldness in their eyes and the calculated steps they were taking, the fragile family I clung to would shatter irreparably. I loved Daniel, still did, in some twisted, painful way. That love blinded me. Then I wrote about Henry, about how he must have sensed the darkness growing inside Daniel but never spoke of it aloud. Maybe he thought it was a phase, something that would pass like a storm. Maybe he was too afraid to face the reality. Henry was a man who sought answers in rocks and rivers, who believed the earth held truths far beyond human pain. Yet here, he was powerless against the slow erosion within his own family. I remembered his last months, the obsession with mapping Widow's Hollow, his drive to document every hidden tunnel and secret chamber. Those maps, those journals weren't just scientific records. They were lifelines. Gifts for me, meant to guide me back if I ever got lost. As the hours slipped by, tears blurred my vision, but I kept typing, pouring memories and pain, hope and despair onto the page. I recounted the moment in the cave when Daniel's betrayal became undeniable, the cruel precision of his plan. The sorry mom scratched into stone, the long hours in suffocating darkness. I described every agonizing detail of those 6 days, the oppressive silence pressing against me like the weight of the earth itself, the drip of water marking time like a heartbeat, the fierce battle between fear and determination. This was more than a story of survival. It was a story of reclamation of my voice, my truth, and myself. The night deepened around me, the only light in the room coming from the laptop's glow. When I finally stopped, I leaned back and exhaled slowly, the room suddenly feeling different, lighter, almost sacred. For the first time in years, the heavy weight I'd carried began to lift. I wasn't just telling a story, I was beginning to heal. Outside, the wind stirred through the pine needles, whispering secrets and soft hymns. The sound was no longer a warning or a threat. It was a quiet applause. For the woman who had walked through darkness and emerged. For the woman who refused to be erased. For the woman who finally found her voice. I closed the laptop and sat in silence, letting the words I'd written settle around me like a fragile mosaic, each piece painful but necessary. My phone buzzed, a message from Mara. "I'm here for you always." I smiled, faintly grateful. This was just the beginning. There were hard conversations ahead and battles to fight, but for the first time in a long time I felt ready. Ready to face the truth. Ready to tell my story. Ready to reclaim the life Daniel tried to steal. And most importantly, ready to live. The days after I finished writing the story felt like living between two worlds, one where the past still clung to me like shadows, and another where the fragile light of truth began to break through. Mara stayed with me after I left the ranger station, her presence a steady comfort amid the chaos. She didn't pressure me to talk. She simply sat beside me when the silence became too loud. But inside the cave still lived in me. Its cold stone walls pressed tight against my ribs every time I closed my eyes. Every drip of water echoed like a heartbeat. Every breath felt measured, like I was still holding myself underwater. The police reopened the investigation, and I agreed to lead the search party back into Widow's Hollow, not alone this time. The memory of that place haunted me, but I knew the truth needed to be uncovered for the world to see, for justice to begin. Returning to the cave was like stepping into a nightmare I hadn't escaped. The smell of damp earth, the chilling darkness, the oppressive silence, it all brought me back to those 6 long days when time had no meaning, and hope felt like a flickering candle. The team was methodical, moving with purpose, listening to my words as I pointed out the narrow tunnels, the hidden fissures, and the places where rock had shifted or fallen. When we reached the chamber where I had been trapped, I showed them the faint chalk marks I'd left, my desperate messages to the outside world carved into the stone. I recounted every detail: the collapse, the crawl through tight passages, the cold water, the growing realization that my son had planned my abandonment. My voice trembled at times, but the officers listened closely, taking notes and photographs. Their serious faces told me they believed me. Afterward, one senior ranger pulled me aside. This isn't just a missing person case anymore. We're recommending charges intentional abandonment, possibly worse. I swallowed hard. It wasn't justice yet, but it was the first step toward it. The thought of facing Daniel in a courtroom telling the story again and again was terrifying, but also strangely liberating. Back home, the news spread quickly. Suddenly, I was no longer invisible. Headlines screamed about the widow's hollow mystery, a mother trapped in a cave, and a son suspected of betrayal. Social media lit up with opinions, many sympathetic, others skeptical. Messages poured in, some from strangers who'd suffered similar betrayals, others from old friends offering support. But there were also whispers of doubt, questions about my mental state, suggestions that perhaps I had lost my grip on reality. I ignored the noise. I was done hiding. I was done softening the truth for the comfort of others. This was my story to tell, and I would tell it on my own terms. Daniel tried to reach out. Calls, texts, even a letter arrived at my door. I read none of them. They might have been apologies, excuses, or threats, I couldn't tell. And I didn't want to know. I was rebuilding, and his words were poison. Instead, I focused on healing. Mara helped me find a therapist, someone who understood trauma and betrayal, who helped me unpack the layers of fear and guilt I carried. Step by step, I began to reclaim myself. One afternoon, Mara and I sat quietly on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air smelled of pine and earth, fresh and alive. I leaned back in my chair, the warmth of the fading sun on my skin, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. "I'm proud of you," Mara said softly. "You didn't just survive, you fought back." I smiled, but the ache in my chest remained. "I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again." She squeezed my hand. "You will, in time." As the investigation deepened, more troubling truths emerged. Angela Henry's cousin came forward with her own story, how Daniel had contacted her last year, probing about the estate, talking about taking responsibility and managing the land. She hadn't known what to make of it then, but now her words carried a new weight. Her testimony strengthened the case and lifted some of the fog of doubt that had surrounded me for so long. It was clear Daniel had been planning this for years, manipulating family and circumstances to his advantage. The legal battle ahead was daunting, but I was no longer the frightened woman trapped underground. I was a witness, armed with evidence and truth. One quiet evening, lying in bed, I thought again of the cave, of its cold, unforgiving walls, and the narrow cracks where fresh air had whispered life back into me. I whispered to the darkness, "I'm coming home." And for the first time, I believed it. The fresh air tasted different the moment I emerged from Widow's Hollow. The cold dampness of the cave's depths gave way to the crisp scent of pine and earth, mingled with the faint sweetness of autumn leaves. It was the same air I had breathed countless times in my youth, but now it felt like a resurrection, like coming back from a place where life had nearly been extinguished. For years, I had known this day might come, the day when I'd have to face the world beyond those shadowed tunnels and crumbling stones. But nothing could have prepared me for the torrent of emotions that surged through me the moment I crossed that threshold. Relief, exhaustion, anger, sorrow, and an aching sense of loss that wrapped around my heart like a thick fog. The path to the surface had been treacherous, a narrow crawl through loose gravel and jagged rock, a climb up a nearly vertical shaft where every foothold felt like it might give way beneath me. My body ached in ways I'd never known, muscles strained and bruised, skin scraped raw, my elbow still throbbing from the fall days earlier. But it was my spirit that bore the deepest wounds, hidden beneath a fragile veneer of determination. As I stepped into the fading daylight, the first thing I saw was the forest canopy stretching endlessly above me, silhouetted against a sky tinged with the orange and purple hues of dusk. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, clean air, and let out a shaky sigh. I was alive. I had survived. But survival was only the beginning. The journey down the ravine was slow and careful. The slope was steep, the ground slippery with fallen leaves and loose stones. Every step required balance and focus, and the ache in my joints reminded me of the toll those 6 days underground had taken. Still, I pressed on, driven by a purpose that went far beyond my physical endurance. When the trees thinned and the first signs of the campsite came into view, my heart sank. There they were: Daniel, Aaron, the children. The picture of a normal family packing up their gear with careless smiles and light laughter that cut through the quiet forest like a blade. Daniel looked just as he always did, confident, composed, unshaken. He laughed at something Aaron said, and the kids ran around with sticks, oblivious to the nightmare their grandmother had endured just miles away. I felt a surge of rage and disbelief. The sheer casualness of it, all the way they acted as though nothing had happened, was like a slap across my face. I stood at the edge of the clearing, every muscle trembling, every breath heavy with emotion. Daniel turned. At first, his expression was confusion, then recognition, and finally, a flicker of something darker: disappointment. "Mom," he said, stepping forward with the kind of forced calm that made my skin crawl. "We were about to call the Rangers. We thought you'd gotten lost." His voice was smooth, rehearsed. I didn't believe a word. "Don't lie to me," I said, voice hoarse but steady. "You walked me into that cave. You left me there. On purpose." Aaron's face went pale. The children stopped their play and looked at me with wide eyes. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have gone that deep," he said coldly. "I told you to stay with Aaron and the kids." I stepped closer, clutching the worn journal page with Henry's handwriting, the evidence of everything I'd endured. "That was the plan, wasn't it?" I spat. "Leave me close enough to be found eventually. Make it look like an accident. Make it look like I wandered off and got lost." He said nothing. I looked at Aaron. "And you? You helped him. You lied for him." Her lips trembled. She opened her mouth, then closed it, unable to deny or confirm. I pulled out my phone despite the near-dead battery and showed the recordings, Daniel's voice in the cave, the messages etched in stone, the maps from Henry's journal. "You can't hide this," I said. "Not anymore." Daniel's composure cracked for the first time, a flicker of fear quickly buried beneath a mask of arrogance. He looked away. "I'm done," I said, turning away from them all. "I'm done being your victim." And with that, I walked into the trees toward the road and the promise of justice. The ranger station felt like a sanctuary, warm, bright, and filled with the quiet hum of purpose. Officers greeted me with professionalism and empathy, a stark contrast to the cold indifference I'd felt in the forest. The medical team examined my injuries. My elbow was badly bruised but not broken. They cleaned my scrapes and bandaged wounds that had become raw and infected. I sat through it all, stoic, focused on the investigation. The lead detective, a woman named Carter, was sharp and relentless. She asked pointed questions, taking in every detail of my ordeal: the planning, the abandonment, the betrayal. She listened when I described the evidence I'd gathered: the maps, the messages, the recordings. "We'll build a case," she promised. "This isn't just a missing person situation anymore. We're looking at attempted homicide, maybe more." I nodded, the weight of those words settling on me like a cold stone. Days turned into weeks. The media frenzy was overwhelming. News outlets spun the story with sensational headlines: "Mother trapped in family cave betrayal," "Son accused of attempted murder," "Widow's hollow nightmare." Somewhere in the noise, genuine support filtered through. Messages from strangers who had faced betrayal and trauma from friends who had long suspected something was wrong. Their words bolstered me, reminded me I wasn't alone. Daniel's name was mud now whispered behind closed doors, dissected in newsrooms, and scrutinized by the police. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling, but there were darker moments too. I was forced to relive the pain, repeatedly testifying to detectives recounting every agonizing detail. I endured whispered judgments from those who doubted me, accusations that I was unstable or mistaken. One night I woke from a nightmare where the cave's shadows reached for me again, where Daniel's voice echoed in the dark, promising I'd never leave. Mara found me sobbing quietly in the kitchen, clutching Henry's journal. "I'm scared," I confessed, "that he'll get away with it." She wrapped her arms around me, steady and strong. "We'll fight this," she said. "Together." The legal proceedings were brutal. Lawyers pushed to discredit me, painting a picture of a frail, confused woman. But I stood firm, armed with evidence and the unwavering truth. During one hearing, Daniel's face twisted with anger and fear when confronted with the recordings from the cave, his own voice admitting everything, his cold words echoing in the courtroom. For the first time, the mask slipped. Throughout it all, I rediscovered strength I hadn't known I possessed. Strength born from surviving the impossible, from facing betrayal and choosing to rise. Every day, I told myself I was not the broken woman Daniel had tried to bury. I was a survivor, a fighter, a witness, and I was coming home. One crisp autumn morning, standing outside the courthouse after a long day of testimony, I felt the weight of the past begin to lift. The sun broke through the clouds, bathing the world in golden light. And in that moment, I whispered to myself, I am free. The first time I saw Daniel after my escape from the cave was at the edge of the forest, the place where the trees gave way to the dirt path leading back to the road. It was late afternoon, the sun lowering, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers between the trunks. He stood there alone, his figure rigid and unmoving like a statue carved out of stone. He hadn't expected me to emerge alive. I could see it in his eyes, surprise flickering, then quickly replaced by something darker, cold calculation, maybe even disappointment. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the thinning trees. The air was thick with unsaid words, with the weight of years filled with bitterness, anger, and fractured love. I didn't move. I let him speak first. "Mom," he said, voice low and measured, "you weren't supposed to come out." The words weren't an accusation. They were a verdict. I stepped forward, my body aching but my voice steady. I wasn't supposed to survive, but here I am. He didn't flinch, but there was a tightness around his eyes. I knew the cage of guilt and fear behind his facade. Maybe for a moment he felt it himself, but he pushed it down like he always had. "Why did you do it?" I asked quietly. "Why did you leave me there?" His jaw clenched as if the answer was a stone stuck in his throat. "You wouldn't listen. You always had to be in control." I laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Control? You mean the control I had over the land, over the family? You mean the control you never had because you chose to hate instead of understand?" He looked away. "You don't get it." "I get it perfectly," I said. "You were angry, jealous, scared. You blamed me for everything. For Dad's death. For the life you didn't want. For the family you felt trapped in." He took a step closer. "You never understood me." "I tried," I whispered. "But you shut me out." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Daniel said, "I thought if I left you there, it would solve everything. I thought it would end the pain for both of us." "You were wrong," I said firmly. "It only started a new kind of pain, one that will haunt us forever." He looked at me, then really looked, as if seeing me for the first time in years. The man who stood before me was a stranger shaped by bitterness and fear, but beneath that, I could still glimpse the boy I once held in my arms. "Can you forgive me?" he asked, voice cracking. I hesitated. Forgiveness was a heavy word tangled with memories and wounds too deep to heal overnight. "I don't know if I can," I said honestly, "but I know I have to try. For my sake. And for yours." He nodded slowly as if relieved. Over the next few days, Daniel and I began the uneasy process of rebuilding a fractured relationship. It wasn't easy. There were tears and arguments, moments of anger and despair. But there were also moments of tentative connection, shared memories, quiet conversations, glimpses of the son I once knew. Aaron and the children kept their distance at first, uncertain how to navigate the new dynamics. But slowly, they too began to re-enter our lives, cautious but hopeful. The investigation continued with evidence mounting against Daniel. The community was divided, some sided with me, others with him. But the truth was undeniable. Despite everything, I tried to keep my focus on healing. I took up gardening again, finding solace in the earth's rhythms and the quiet growth of new life. I reconnected with old friends and joined a local support group for survivors of family betrayal. Their stories mirrored mine in painful ways, reminding me I was not alone. One afternoon, as I tended to my small garden, Mara came to visit. She found me kneeling by a bed of chrysanthemums, their bright blooms a stark contrast to the heaviness in my heart. "You look stronger," she said, smiling gently. "I feel stronger," I replied. "But the scars remain." She nodded. "They always will. But scars can be reminders of survival, not just pain." I looked up at her, grateful for her unwavering support. The courtroom was a battleground. Daniel's defense lawyers tried every tactic to discredit me, painting me as unstable, exaggerating, even accusing me of fabricating evidence. But the prosecution was thorough, presenting the maps, the journal entries, the recordings from the cave, and testimonies from Angela and others who had seen Daniel's true nature. The day the verdict came was a blur of emotions. Daniel was found guilty of attempted murder and unlawful confinement. The judge's words echoed in my ears long after the courtroom emptied. Justice had been served, but the wounds were far from healed. In the quiet that followed, I found myself reflecting on the journey, the darkness of the cave, the betrayal of my son, the long road back to light. I realized that survival was not just about enduring pain, but about finding meaning beyond it, about reclaiming your story, your voice, and your power. As I stood on the porch of my home one evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. I had walked through darkness and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. And finally, I was coming home. The days after the verdict settled over me like a fragile calm after a storm. Daniel was gone, taken into custody, his fate sealed by the law, and the truth that could no longer be denied. But the silence he left behind in the house and the family was heavy and strange. It was the absence of a presence that had haunted me for years, a wound that didn't heal with his imprisonment. I wandered through the rooms Henry and I had filled with memories, the worn furniture, the faded photographs, the shelves lined with books and trinkets collected over a lifetime. The house felt emptier, quieter, but not peaceful. It was a place suspended between what was and what could never be again. Mara visited often. She helped me with practical things: bank statements, legal documents, phone calls I couldn't bring myself to make. But mostly she sat with me in the silence, her presence a steady anchor. One afternoon, as we sat in the sunlit kitchen, Mara said quietly, "What now?" I looked at her, feeling the weight of that question settle deep inside. What now, after the fight, after the betrayal, after the long dark journey? What now? I don't know. I admitted. I'm tired of surviving. I want to live. Living meant rebuilding, and that meant facing the past, but also letting go. I started with the land, the piece of earth Henry had loved so fiercely, the last tangible connection to our family's legacy. For years, Daniel had wanted to sell it, to erase the memories and replace them with profit. I had refused. Now, with the threat gone, I had a chance to honor Henry's wishes. I walked the fields, the soil soft beneath my boots, the wind whispering through the tall grass. I remembered childhood days spent exploring these woods, teaching Daniel to identify wildflowers and listen for the calls of birds. The land was alive with stories, and I vowed to keep them safe. I began restoring the old farmhouse, a labor of love and a symbol of reclaiming what was lost. With each brushstroke of paint, each repaired window, I felt pieces of myself return: strength, purpose, hope. The community, once divided, slowly began to rally around me. Neighbors stopped by with meals, shared stories of their own struggles, and offered friendship. The support was a balm to my weary heart. I joined a local women's group where I met others who had faced betrayal, loss, and the struggle to rebuild. Their stories intertwined with mine, creating a tapestry of resilience and healing. But healing was not linear. There were days when the past clawed back, flashbacks of the cave, the suffocating darkness, the sound of Daniel's voice echoing in my mind. Nights when sleep escaped me, replaced by restless dreams and tears. Therapy became my refuge. My counselor helped me navigate the labyrinth of grief and anger, teaching me to forgive not Daniel, not yet, but myself. To let go of guilt I never deserved. To find peace amid the chaos. One evening, I stood by the window watching the stars blink alive in the darkening sky. Mara joined me, handing me a cup of tea. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "The fight, the truth, everything I thought about the cave, the betrayal, the pain. About the moments when giving up seemed easier, when silence felt safer." "No," I said firmly, "because without it, I wouldn't be who I am now. I wouldn't have found the strength I never knew I had." She smiled, and we sat in silence, two souls bound by love and resilience. The legal aftermath was complex. Daniel's sentencing was scheduled, appeals, filed, lawyers working tirelessly. I attended hearings, feeling the weight of every word spoken, every detail laid bare. Each time I told myself it was for justice, not vengeance, for the safety of others, for my own peace. Slowly, I began to reconnect with Daniel's children. They were young, confused, caught between loyalty and truth. Our conversations were tentative, filled with questions and guarded emotions. I didn't want to replace their mother, but I wanted to be a safe harbor, a reminder that love could still exist amid brokenness. One afternoon, we planted a tree together in the garden, a small sapling that would grow tall and strong, a symbol of new beginnings. As we worked, laughter bubbled up between us, fragile but real. In that moment, I felt hope. The land, the house, the family, they were healing slowly, imperfectly. Like the wildflowers that pushed through cracks in the stone, like the sun that rose after the darkest night. I knew scars would remain, both visible and hidden. But I also knew I could live with them, because I had survived, because I was finally free. As I closed my journal one night, I whispered a promise to myself and to Henry's memory. I would keep walking forward, no longer just surviving, but truly living. The final days before the trial felt like walking on a razor's edge. Every step, every breath carried the weight of what was to come. Daniel's trial was the culmination of years of pain, betrayal, and survival, a reckoning not just for him, but for me, for the family, for the fragile truth we had clawed back from the darkness. The courtroom was filled with faces I recognized and many I didn't. Reporters whispered behind cameras, their eyes hungry for the next detail, the next twist in this unfolding drama. But I wasn't here to perform. I was here to bear witness, to tell the story that had almost been buried forever. Sitting across from Daniel, I could feel the tension crackling like static in the air. He was calm on the surface, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty beneath. The same man who had tried to silence me now faced the undeniable proof of his actions. When my turn came to speak, I rose slowly, steadying myself against the years of trauma and the shadows that still lingered. I told the story again: the betrayal, the 6 days trapped in the cave, the shattered trust. But this time, my voice carried something new, not just pain, but strength. I spoke of the moments when I wanted to give up, when the darkness threatened to consume me. I spoke of the small lights, the memory of Henry's maps, the chalk marks on stone, the water dripping like a heartbeat. I spoke of survival, not just of body, but of spirit. The courtroom was silent. Even Daniel's lawyers were caught off guard by the raw honesty of my testimony. When I finished, I sat down feeling the tremor of exhaustion wash over me. But beneath it was a fierce fire, the knowledge that I had reclaimed my voice and that the truth could no longer be buried. The trial lasted weeks. Evidence piled up the journal pages, the recordings from the cave testimonies from Angela and others who had witnessed Daniel's manipulation. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man consumed by greed and bitterness, willing to abandon his own mother to silence her forever. The defense tried to dismantle every piece, casting doubt, questioning my mental state, suggesting alternative explanations. But the truth was undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming. The day the verdict was announced, the courtroom was thick with tension. Guilty. The word hit me like a thunderclap. Daniel's face drained of color. His facade crumbled. Justice had been served. But the real victory was mine, not in his downfall, but in my survival and truth. Life after the trial was different. The house no longer felt haunted by silence, but filled with cautious hope. Mara and I worked to heal the wounds, emotional, physical, and spiritual. The land Henry had loved became a sanctuary, a place where memories could be honored and new stories planted. I reconnected with Daniel's children, building a fragile bridge over the broken past. We planted trees, shared stories, and slowly the seeds of forgiveness and trust began to take root. But the road wasn't without pain. I still carried the scars of betrayal, the shadows of those 6 days deep in the cave. There were nights when the darkness returned, when memories flooded back unbidden. Therapy helped, but healing was a lifelong journey. One evening, as I sat watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and purple, I felt a profound peace. I had walked through the valley of shadows and emerged into light. I was not just a survivor, I was a woman reclaimed. I whispered a promise to the wind, to Henry's memory, and to myself. I would live fully, love deeply, speak boldly, no longer bound by fear or silence, no longer defined by betrayal. I was free. And with that freedom came hope. A hope that the future would be brighter, that the wounds would heal, that love would prevail. As the stars blinked alive in the night sky, I closed my eyes and let the past fall away. The cave, the betrayal, the pain, all part of my story. But not the end, because now I was writing the rest. Thank you for listening. If you've faced betrayal or found strength in darkness, share your story below. Subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories of survival, healing, and hope.